asked Heki, and Sumi and Daniel said she looked very nice. This was true. Heki had gone to Madame Rosalia for advice about what to wear for her night out with the furrier, but she had made it clear that she wanted to be tastefully dressed. I may be a witch, Heki had said to Madame Rosalia, but I am also a woman. So she had decided not to wear black whiskers on her chin or a blue tooth, and just 3 blackheads, more enlarged paws really, on the end of her nose. And her dress was tasteful too, a black sheath embroidered all over with small green toads. My shoes pinch, said Heki, but there was nothing to be done about that. Heki's toe of transformation always hurts when she bought new shoes. Mr. Naksat had booked a table by the window and ordered a 3-course meal. He hated spending money, but he knew that if he was going to get the witch to do what he wanted, he'd have to make a splash for once. The Trocadero was very smart, with gleaming white tablecloths and a man playing sloppy music on the piano, but the dinner didn't get off to a very good start. The trouble began with a beetle that was crawling about in the centre of a rose in a cut glass vase on the table. Heki thought the beetle did not look well, and she asked the waiter if he'd mind putting it out in the garden, if possible, near a cowpat. It's a dung beetle, you see, she told him, so it really cannot be happy on this rose. Then the starter came, and it was shrimps in mayonnaise. Is there anything wrong? Asked Mr. Naksat. They look nice and pink to me. Yes, said Heki faintly, but you see, shrimps aren't meant to be pink. They're meant to be a sort of grey. If they're pink, they're dead. Well, we could hardly eat them if they weren't, said Mr. Naksat. But he had to keep on the right side of Heki, so he sent them back and ordered vegetable soup. After the shrimps came some meat in a brown sauce, and when Heki saw it, she turned quite pale. Now, what's the matter? Asked Mr. Naksat. Those are pheasant breasts done in wine. I know they're pheasant breasts, said Heki faintly, but you see, eating them would be, well, like eating a friend. And as Mr. Naksat frowned at her, you must know what I mean. Think of a friend of yours. Any friend. Mr. Naksat tried to think of a friend he had. There was a boy called Marvin Miner at my prep school. He used to lend me his roller skates. Well, now you see, said Heki. Imagine you were served slices of Marvin Miner's chest in wine sauce. How would you feel? But even now, Mr. Naksat kept his temper. The pheasant breasts were taken away and Heki was given a mushroom omelette instead, and there was no fuss over the pudding. Even Heki didn't think that caramel custard was like swallowing a friend. By now they had drunk quite a lot of wine, and Mr. Naksat was ready to come to the point. I have a favour to ask you, he said, leaning across the table and fixing Heki with his piercing eyes. A great favour. Heki looked down at the tablecloth and tried to flutter her eyelashes like she had seen Madame Rosalia do. Yes, she said shyly. I want you to make a tiger for me. I want you to change the next wicked person you see into a tiger, a male tiger, and large. Well, I will if you like, Lionel, said Heki, because she had been told to use his Christian name. But are you sure you can manage it? They are tricky things to look after, the big cats. It's not for me personally. I wouldn't ask you anything for myself, said Mr. Naksat superly. It's for a friend of mine, an aristocrat, a lord. Oh, really? Everyone is a bit impressed by lords, and Heki was no exception. Yes, the poor man was left a great castle. I don't like to talk about him because he's very shy, but you'd know the name if I told you. But it's in a very bad state. Loose tiles on the roof, dry rot, all that kind of thing. So he started a safari park to bring in the trippers and help him get enough money to do repairs. But what the safari park really needs is a tiger. Well, if you're sure he'd care for it properly, it would live like a prince, said Mr. Knapsack. A heated house, a huge enclosure, children to come and photograph it, and my friend would be so happy. Heckie stirred her coffee. All right then. Mind you, one can't be absolutely certain with this kind of magic. Sometimes things sort of happen by themselves. There was an animal witch in Germany who kept being overcome by hippopotamuses. Whatever she tried to turn people into, they always came out as hippos. Mr. Knapsack didn't like the sound of that. No one wore coats made of hippopotamus skins. I'm sure that wouldn't happen to you, dear Heckie, he said. You're such a powerful witch. I knew the moment I saw you. As soon as he got back to his shop that evening, Mr. Knapsack telephoned a man he knew in Manchester. Is that you, Ferguson? Yes, it's me. Well, listen, I've got you your tiger skin, a full-grown male. Go on, you're kidding. No, I'm not. I take it the Arkle woman still wants one. You bet she does. She's up the price to 2,500. Gertrude Arkle was married to a chain store millionaire and had set her heart on a tiger skin to put on her bedroom floor. She wanted to lie on it in silk pyjamas, like she had seen film stars do in pictures of the olden days. And the more Mr. Arkle told her that she couldn't have one because it was illegal to import them, the more she wanted one. All right then, said Mr. Knapsack. I'll give you a call when it's ready. Chapter 13. For nearly 3 weeks after Heckie had dinner with Mr. Knapsack at the Trocadero, life went on much as usual. Heckie was still trying to get the dragworm to speak. She told him stories and repeated simple words to him. But though he was always polite and listened to everything she said, it didn't seem as though he was ever going to talk. In other ways, though, he was learning all the time. He could turn the bath tap on now with his front claws and put in the plug, and he didn't have to think nearly so long about which of his feet was which. Heckie had worried as the days grew warmer that he might become unsettled. Chinese dragons usually fly up to heaven in the spring, and she would have missed him horribly if he had done so. But he stayed where he was. Still, things were not quite the same as before, and this was because of Mr. Knapsack. The furrier never came to the flat because of the dragworm, but the children had seen him in the street and they didn't like what they saw. They thought he looked thoroughly creepy and unreliable, and they couldn't understand why Heckie went out with him. The children weren't the only ones to be worried. The cheese wizard's shop was next door to the furrier's, and he knew quite a lot about Mr. Knapsack. Daniel had met him in the street and been asked in to see a Stilton that could walk at least half a metre. And it's not maggots either, it's magic, said Mr. Gurgle, beaming at the cheese as it struggled across the floor. But afterwards he became serious. I don't like the way that fellow's paying court to Heckie, he said. He's got a bad name in the trade, up to his eyebrows in debt, and the way he treated those sewing women who worked for him was a scandal. If she marries him, she'll... Oh, but she couldn't, cried Daniel, looking completely stricken. Well, I don't suppose she will, but she's all heart and no head, that witch. Just you keep an eye on her. But this was easier said than done. Mr. Knapsack was careful always to see Heckie away from the shop. Since he hated spending money, he took her on picnics. Heckie brought the food so it didn't cost him anything, and all he brought was a towel to sit on because he didn't like nature and was fussy about his trousers. Mr. Knapsack realised that it was no good pretending that he wasn't a furrier after all. His shop was in Market Square for everyone to see. So he told Hecky a lot of lies about the coats he sold. That beaver cape in my window was made by a tribe of North American Indians who worship beavers. They sing to them and feed them on pine nuts and take them to sleep with them in their wigwams so that they live for years and years and years. And then when they pass on, the beavers, I mean, the Indians make them into coats so that they won't be forgotten. Oh, Lily, that's wonderful, said Hecky, feasting her eyes on Mr. Knapsack as they sat on a rock high above the Wellbridge gasworks. And the stoats I use come from an organic stoat farm in Sweden. They shave the animals and sew the fur onto canvas so it looks like a pelt, but it isn't. Only when it's warm, they shave them. No stoat is ever allowed to get chilled. So Hecky's last doubts were gone. Not only was Mr. Knapsack the handsomest man she had ever seen, but he was kind to animals. But inside, Mr. Knapsack was seething. 3 weeks and not a sign of a tiger. How long was he supposed to go on buttering up this ridiculous witch? Sumi had put her 3 little brothers to bed. She had sung to them and played 3 little pigs go to market with the fat toes of the youngest, and now they were drowsy and quiet. Down in the shop, her mother was putting the closed sign across the door, and her father was emptying the till. You're closing early? She asked in the Punjabi they always spoke when they were alone. It was only 8:30, and her parents often served customers till late at night. Her mother nodded. She looked tired and her eyes were swollen. Is anything wrong? Sumi adored her parents, and her voice was sharp with anxiety. No, nothing. Her mother managed a smile. We're just going to have an early night. But there was something wrong. Sumi knew from the way her parents went upstairs, walking very close together, their shoulders almost touching. They weren't like the parents of her school friends, kissing and hugging in front of everyone. They were dignified and shy. But tonight they needed to be very close. Sumi went to bed, but she couldn't sleep. And her mother and father couldn't sleep either. She heard their voices, low and sad, going on and on. After a while, she got up and crept to the door. If there was trouble in the family, she wanted to know and help. Shall we tell Sumi? We'll keep the boys indoors, but she'll have to have protection when she goes to school. I don't want her going out of the house while he's here with his thugs. And we must get metal shutters for the windows. Expensive. Her father sounded worried. Expensive? What does that matter? We can borrow. You know what happened to Ved. You saw my sister's face when they brought him home, and you talk about expensive. Back in her room, Sumi began to shiver. It was a warm night, but she couldn't stop trembling, for she knew what had happened to Ved. She knew what was making her parents so afraid. Oh, what shall I do? Thought Sumi. Whatever shall I do? Hecky was clearing away her breakfast when Sumi rang the doorbell of the flat. She was pleased to see her. People were always pleased to see Sumi, but worried that she'd be late for school. It doesn't matter if I am, said Sumi. And then Hecky knew that there was something seriously wrong, because Sumi really loved school. What is it, dear? So then Sumi told her. A man is coming to Wellbridge, an absolutely terrible man. He's called Max Swinton, and he's the leader of something called the White Avengers. Hecky frowned. Those racist thugs who go round bashing up people. Yes, And it's Swinton that leads them on. He's worse than Hitler. They shout things that don't sound so terrible, like British for the British. But by British, they only mean people with white skins. And they don't care what they do to the others. She stopped to blow her nose. I have this cousin in London, Ved he's called. He was a violinist. He won a scholarship to music college when he was 15. He was coming home alone after a concert when a gang of Swinton thugs got hold of him. We thought he wouldn't live at first, he was so badly hurt. But he did live. He's alive, only his hands. When they saw the violin, they jumped on his hands. They said, Wogs shouldn't. Sumi gulped and groped for her handkerchief, and Heki put her arms round her and waited till she could go on. Then she lifted her head and said what she had come to say. I told Daniel that I didn't think it was right to turn people into animals, but I've changed my mind. Please, Heki, please, will you turn Max Swinton into absolutely anything? Swinton's picture was in the next day's paper. The dragworm wouldn't stay in the same room with it and went to have a bath while Heki and Daniel studied his face. He looks like a pig, said Daniel. No, he doesn't, said Heki firmly. Pigs may have small eyes, but they are intelligent eyes, and if they're fat, it's a firm fatness, not wobbly. Swinton was coming to Wellbridge on the following Monday in a motorcade to make speeches. The police had broken up Swinton's rallies before. He had even been to prison, but never long enough to keep him and his followers off the streets. He's staying at the Queen's Hotel, I see, said Heki. Didn't you say you had a friend whose mother worked there? Yes, I did. Henry, he's called. He's really nice, and his older brother has just started as a bellboy. I'm sure he'd help us. Henry's black. I expect he feels just like Sumi does about the Avengers. The Queen's Hotel was very grand. It stood on the edge of the park with its pretty flower beds and statues, and the pond where Heki had found the duck that didn't want to live. Towers and turrets burst from the roof of the hotel, and flags blew in the wind, and there were awnings and waiters rushing about and a whole army of chambermaids. So you think Henry can be trusted? That he can keep a secret? Yes, I do. Good. Then I suggest you go and find him straight away and bring him here. Mr. Knapsack read Heki's note and his eyes glittered with greed. A tiger, at last. He was to arrange for a closed horse box and a driver and get hold of a wired tunnel of the kind that circus trainers used to lead animals into the ring. Because we don't want the poor dear creature getting scared and muddled, Heki had written. Henry's brother was going to meet her in the park at daybreak with the key to Max Swinton's room and a chambermaid's uniform belonging to his mother. Then I'll slip into his room with his early morning tea and change him. By great good luck, he's got a downstairs room, so you'll be able to park the horse box almost under his window. Remember to have a nice raw steak ready for him. Tigers can get very hungry when they're on the road. Oh yes, the brute would find a steak all right, thought Mr. Knapsack. A drug steak, which would knock him out, then a clean shot between the eyes so as to make the smallest possible hole in the pelt, and off to be skinned. Mr. Knapsack had even arranged for a man who made pet food to take the carcass. £2,000 clear. Alone in his shop, the furrier smiled and rubbed his hands. Heki was up before it was light, feeling extremely happy. She'd enjoyed changing Mrs. Winnipeg and the chicken farmer, but in ridding the world of Max Swinton, she was doing more good than she'd ever done before, and giving her Lili, the tiger he wanted so much for his friend. Daniel was waiting for her at the gates of the park. She had promised he could come just till she met Henry's brother, Clem, but no sooner had Daniel run up to her then Mr. Knapsack came round the corner in his bowler hat and fur-collared coat. "Lionel, I didn't expect you. Why aren't you with the horse box?" "I just wanted to see you safely into the hotel, dear," said the furrier. But what Mr. Knapsack really wanted was to make sure that Hecky didn't change her mind or go all soft. One thing he couldn't be doing was with a hippopotamus. Daniel wasn't at all pleased to see the furrier, but he had to be polite, and together they walked past the flower beds and the pond and between smooth lawns that were still wet with dew. Clem had kept his promise. He was waiting by the fountain with the key and the uniform. "Everything's okay," he whispered. "He's in room 17, like I said." Hecky thanked him, and they waited while he ran back to the hotel, where all the guests still slept. Then they followed him, making their way along a gravel path between neatly clipped hedges. "Funny, there's a new statue," said Mr. Knapsack, pointing with his cane. "Yes, there is," said Daniel. Hecky had been thinking of the job ahead of her. Now she looked up, stopped, took a step towards the statue, and another. Then she put back her head and screamed. Daniel reached her first. "What is it?" he gasped. "What's the matter?" But Hecky couldn't speak. She just pointed at the statue with a hand which shook as if she had a dreadful fever. "It's Dora," she managed to bring out. "Dora Maybury did it. She's betrayed me. She's cheated me. She's done me out of my triumph. This is her work. I'd know it anywhere." Daniel went right up to the statue, and then he understood. It was Max Swinton who stood there, carefully mounted on a marble slab. Max Swinton's mean little eyes, his silly moustache, his fat chin were all there in stone. His trousers tight over his straining thighs, his bulging beer belly, the Avenger's badge, all were there for ever and ever, caught in white marble now, touched by the first rays of the morning sun. Chapter 14. The night after she found Max Swinton's statue, Hecky couldn't sleep. She kept thinking how wicked Dora Maybury had been, snatching the politician from her and doing poor Mr. Knapsack out of his tiger. Copying Hecky's hat had been bad enough, but this was far, far worse. But the more she tried to tell herself how awful Dora had been, the more she kept remembering things from the 30 years that both of them had been at school. The time that Dora had cut her toenails for her because Hecky had hurt her back doing chimney landing practice. The way Dora always picked the earwigs out of the Hoover bag when it was her turn to clean the dorm because she knew how it upset Hecky when earwigs were put in the bin. And what a netball player the witch had been. Was it possible that Dora hadn't meant to upset Hecky? Did she too just think that Max Swinton ought not to be around any longer? And where was Dora? Could she have moved to Wellbridge? In the morning, as soon as she had fed the animals in the shop and given the dragworm his princess, Hecky went to see Mr. Gurgle to ask him if he'd heard anything about the stone witch. The cheese wizard was in a bad mood because his Stilton had developed a limp, but he tried to be helpful. "I haven't heard anything myself," he said, "but Frida Fennell did say as how a stonemason's business out in Fecklington had changed hands. That's past the prison, you know. She did say that the quality of work was very high and she was wondering." So Hecky went to see the garden witch, who was wheeling a single artichoke along in her wheelbarrow, her muscles straining because it was the size of an armchair. And she said, yes, she was almost sure the new owner of the stonemasons was a witch. There was something about the garden gnomes that was special. But when Hecky had got the address, she couldn't make up her mind. Suppose Dora was still angry with her. Also, there'd been rather a fuss about Max Swinton, since statues, unlike animals, can't run away or be sent to the zoo. Questions were being asked, and though no one guessed the truth, there was a lot of puzzlement. She was still deciding what to do when she met Mr. Knapsack for tea at the Copper Kettle. The furrier had gone off in a rage when he heard that he wasn't getting his tiger, but since then he had done some serious thinking. A witch who could turn people into animals, and another witch who could turn people into stone. What did that suggest? To Mr. Knapsack, it suggested riches beyond his dreams, a life of plenty in which he need never work again. The plan he now came up with could only have been worked out by someone half mad with cruelty and greed. But Mr. Knapsack was exactly such a man. So he wrote a little note to Hecky saying he was sorry he had lost his temper, but he'd been so upset at disappointing his friend, who was a lord, and inviting Hecky to meet him for tea. Hecky was terribly pleased to see him, and she asked him at once what he thought she should do about Dora Maybury. You see, I do hate to go on quarrelling, but I couldn't bear it if she was unkind to me. What do you think I should do, Lily? This gave Mr. Knapsack just the opening he was looking for. I tell you what, my dear, he said, smiling his gooey smile. Since you're such a shy and delicate little thing, why don't you let me go? I'll give her your message, and I'll tell her you want to be friends and see what she says. Oh, would you, Lily? That's so kind of you, so like you. I'll write her a letter and give it to you. So Hecky wrote a letter in which she said that while she had been rather cross about Mr. Swinton, who was really hers, if Dora really hadn't known what Hecky was going to do, then she was happy to let bygones be bygones. Because I have missed you very much, dear Dora, wrote Hecky. And then she sealed the envelope and gave it to Mr. Knapsack to take to her friend. But what did Mr. Knapsack do? As soon as he was out of sight, he tore the letter into little pieces and threw them away. Not even into a bin, because he was a little out as well as a creep. Just away in the street where the wind blew them all over the place. Then he hailed a taxi and drove to the stonemason's yard. Dora Maybury was in her overalls and Wellington boots, chipping with a chisel at the nose of a Greek hero whom a rich businessman wanted to put in his park. Just as Hecky kept an ordinary pet shop to earn her living, in which the rabbits and guinea pigs really were rabbits and guinea pigs and not changed people, so Dora did ordinary stonework for anyone who would pay her, and she did it very well. The hero was the kind with a lion skin round his shoulders and a lot of muscles and a club. Mr. Knapsack stood for a while watching before he coughed softly and asked if he was in the presence of Miss Dora Maybury. That's me, said Dora, nodding, and she wiped her chisel and looked at the handsome man in his dark coat with the raccoon collar and the black hat. Come in, she said, blushing a little, because there had been no gentleman in the Witch Academy, and she was very shy. Mr. Knapsack followed her in, his nose twitching with curiosity. So this homely woman could turn a man into stone. Quite a lot of men, if need be. I've come with a message from a friend of yours, a Miss Hecate Tembury Smith. Hecky! Dora's round little eyes lit up. How is she? Tell me about her, please. Oh, I have missed her so. For it was true. Dora had not meant to annoy Hecky. Though she had moved back to Wellbridge, hoping to make it up with her friend, she had not dared to go and see her. Suppose Hecky snubbed her? Then she had read about Max Swinton in the paper and become very upset. A man like that shouldn't be allowed to exist, she thought, And when Swinton took a stroll in the park, she'd been ready for him. It had been hard work dragging him to the right spot, mounting him properly, but she'd done it and been proud of her handiwork. In the old days, she'd have gone straight to Heki and shown her what she'd done. So now she waited eagerly for what Mr. Naksat had to say. And that's where I'm leaving it.